You feel it first, not as a thought, but as a pulse in your ribs, a weight that lingers in your chest, or the ache that has haunted you for years without ever announcing its name. That ache is not random. It is the shadow knocking. It whispers in your sleepless nights and in the patterns you can't seem to escape. A relationship ends in the same weary way. The same hour brings the same dread, and your confidence fractures under the same familiar triggers. These are not accidents. They are emotional loops, repetitions of the psyche that signal what remains unintegrated. The human mind is ritualistic. It repeats until it resolves. What you call punishment is a portal, and what you call curse is a cry for union. Each loop is the voice of the forgotten self, the part you exiled to survive, asking if you will finally come back for it. The shadow does not arrive to destroy you. It arrives to be seen. It is not evil, but unloved. It is the child silenced, the tears dismissed, the rage smiled over, the desire buried in shame. You thought you abandoned it, but it never left. It hid behind your perfectionism, your relentless busyness, your righteousness, your careful mask of control. And the more you deny it, the more insistently it choreographs your life. The ache is a message. Dissent is required. Every myth has its underworld. Heroes do not find gold in daylight. They must pass through caves, face monsters, endure nights without light. Jung understood this not as a punishment, but as individuation. The descent where the fragmented soul is gathered. To resist the descent is to stay trapped in the loop. To embrace it is to begin the spiral. The shadow carries frozen energy. It holds what your ego could not allow. The scream you never voiced. The terror you hid. The hunger you denied. It took the fall so you could appear kind. It became loud so you could survive small. It grew furious so you could present gentle. Now, in adulthood, what once protected you has turned into a cage. You find yourself overreacting, fearing intimacy, sabotaging trust, shrinking before authority, or chasing validation with desperate thirst. None of it makes sense until you trace the thread back, and there waits the shadow with the frozen flame of your unmet need. This first recognition, the ache named, the loop mapped, the portal reframed, is the threshold. Will you finally listen? The descent is not indulgence, but integration. To integrate means to welcome the voice beneath your voice, to sit with what scares you instead of running. It means facing the mirror not to criticize, but to recognize. Pause here and notice. Where in your life do the loops repeat with eerie precision? What wound keeps attracting the same characters, the same endings? That recognition is the shadow's invitation. Before we move deeper, let me invite you into a small act. Pause this video for a breath and type in the comments. Where are you watching from? And what time of day is it right now? By grounding ourselves in the present moment, by marking time and place, we begin to anchor awareness rather than drift through unconscious repetition. And while you're here, remember to subscribe to Carl Jung's Stories Unveiled and turn on the notification bell, so each descent, each exploration, meets you in real time without delay. Now we return. The shadow waits, not as enemy, but as guide. You must descend. You must feel what you swore you would never feel again. You must name what you thought would stay hidden forever. Because wholeness requires remembering all that has been dismembered. Only by entering the cave does the possibility of freedom emerge. The ache is not cruelty, it is the threshold. And just beyond it, the path of shadow work begins, where loops are not punishments, but initiations. As we step forward, The next movement is clear. We must follow the shadow onto its path and learn the difference between indulging it and integrating it, between drowning in the dark and drawing from its energy. That is where the work truly begins. The path of the shadow does not unfold in sunlight, but in twilight. Half seen, half felt, always carrying both danger and possibility. To walk it, you must understand one principle above all. Integration is not indulgence. Too often we are taught to either suppress the shadow with false light or to indulge it in destructive ways. Both keep you trapped in the loop. Integration, however, is the alchemy of taking what was once exiled and bringing it into wholeness with presence. When you first meet your shadow, it may look like chaos. Rage flares at something small. Jealousy coils in the pit of your stomach. Shame grips you before you even speak. The temptation is either to condemn yourself or to act out impulsively. Condemnation hardens the ice. Indulgence burns without transformation. Integration, by contrast, requires you to sit in the heat without collapsing or escaping. It asks you to pause, breathe, name the sensation, and allow it to thaw in the warmth of your awareness. This is not about wallowing. It is about listening. Imagine the shadow as the guardian of your deepest wound. It holds what you could not face when you were small and defenseless. It raged so you could appear kind. It stayed loud so you could remain unnoticed. It carried terror so your ego could survive. To integrate it now is to approach this guardian not with judgment, but with presence. You ask, "What are you protecting? What do you still carry for me?" And often the answers are simple, human, heartbreaking. I was terrified. I wanted to be held. I never got to say no. This is the thawing. Each time you hold the shadow with love rather than exile, the ice begins to melt. You feel the energy unfreeze. Your chest softens, your breath deepens, your voice steadies. Creativity reawakens. Dreams become clearer. You begin to parent the inner child instead of letting that child hijack your life. Here lies the art of inner alchemy. Alchemy is not the turning of lead into literal gold, but of unconscious pain into conscious presence. The alchemist in you takes avoidance and turns it into awareness, shame into compassion, pain into truth. Shadow work is this slow, sacred transmutation. It is not glamorous. It is not finished in a weekend retreat. It is a lifelong companionship with the parts of you once locked away. And as you practice, you notice a shift in how you see others. Where once you judged them harshly, you now recognize their shadows too. The narcissist becomes not just a villain, but a collapsed child behind a mask of grandeur. The critic becomes not only cruel, but also a terrified perfectionist desperate for control. The addict reveals not weakness, but unbearable ancestral grief. By integrating your own shadow, you begin to see others not as enemies, but as mirrors. And in that recognition, projection begins to dissolve. This is the difference between indulging and integrating. Indulgence keeps you reacting. Integration makes you present. Indulgence adds fuel to the loop. Integration breaks its gears. Indulgence leaves you drained. Integration leaves you whole. Ask yourself, when did you last lash out, withdraw, or sabotage without understanding why? What if instead of condemning yourself, you had paused to ask, "Shadow, what are you trying to protect?" That simple pivot is the doorway. It interrupts the loop. Remember, presence is not passive. It is the most active force of all. It means staying when every cell wants to run. It means breathing when the memory burns. It means listening when the voice shakes. And in that staying, You reclaim the pieces of yourself you thought were gone forever. The path of the shadow is not an escape, but a return. You do not journey to become better. You journey to become whole. And wholeness is not saintliness. It is contradiction, complexity, truth. It is being able to say, I love and I fear, I hope and I grieve, I rage and I forgive. The shadow's path is not a detour. It is the road itself. And as you walk it, you will begin to dream differently. Symbols will appear, archetypes will rise, and your unconscious will speak in a language older than words. That is where we must go next, into dreams and symbols, where the shadow hides in metaphor and myth, waiting to be decoded. The deeper you go into the shadow, the more you realize it rarely speaks in plain sentences. Instead, it speaks in dreams, symbols, and archetypes, those timeless blueprints of the psyche that Jung dedicated his life to uncovering. If the conscious mind is a straight line, the unconscious is a labyrinth woven in images. To understand your shadow, you must learn to walk in that labyrinth, to read its symbolic tongue. Every dream is a letter from the unconscious. The monster chasing you is not random. It is a fragment of yourself you have avoided. The faceless figure pressing near is the part of you never allowed to take form. The storm tearing through your dream is the rage you suppressed, waiting for recognition. In the daylight, you might dismiss these as nonsense, but symbols are the soul's grammar. To ignore them is to remain illiterate in your own story. Consider how often life itself feels like a dream stitched by symbols. A certain song plays at the exact moment your heart breaks. A repeated number follows you for weeks. An unexpected encounter mirrors an old wound. These are not coincidences. They are fingerprints of the self, guiding you toward what still asks to be integrated. Archetypes are the larger forces shaping these symbols. They are not invented myths, but living patterns within you. When you rage at being abandoned, it is not only you, it is the wounded child archetype crying through you. When you attract controlling partners, it is the shadow feminine searching for her lost father. When you withdraw from intimacy and call it independence, it is the rebel archetype choosing isolation over loss. You are not merely personal. You are archetypal. This realization frees you from shame because it shows you that your struggles are not private defects, but shared human dramas. The shadow often carries these archetypes in distorted form. The trickster who sabotages just when you approach love. The warrior who never rests, leaving you burnt out. The critic who punishes you for every misstep. The witch whose rage was buried beneath cultural fear. Each archetype has a gift, but when repressed, it rules you unconsciously. Shadow work is about reclaiming the archetype in its balanced form, seeing the trickster as creative play, the warrior as discipline, the critic as discernment, the witch as intuition. Notice how this shifts your relationship to triggers. Instead of blaming the person who irritates you, you ask, what archetype in me is being touched? The outer figure becomes a mirror. The loop you dreaded reveals itself as a teaching device. What once felt like harassment from the world becomes dialogue with your own depths. Here is the danger of ignoring the symbolic. You reduce life to surface events, and in doing so, you miss the hidden curriculum of your psyche. You believe you are unlucky in love, when in truth your dreams are showing you the abandoned child inside. You think you are cursed with fear, when in reality the monster is guarding your unmet need for safety. Without symbolic literacy, you remain trapped in loops. With it, the loops transform into spirals of growth. Symbols also ask for participation, not control. You cannot demand a dream to make sense on your terms. You must enter it with curiosity. What did the darkness feel like? What memory does this echo? The dream is not a puzzle to solve, but a story to live with. Over time, its meaning ripens. This is where the shadow becomes less enemy and more teacher. In symbols, it reveals its motives, not to wound you further, but to return what was lost. The shadow is the guardian of your pain, and pain is often the doorway to power. Rage can show you boundaries. Fear can reveal courage. Shame can uncover humility. Each loop is a sacred message disguised as repetition. As you learn this symbolic language, something shifts. You stop being ruled by archetypes in secret and begin to dialogue with them openly. You recognize the warrior, the child, the trickster, the lover, the destroyer within. They cease to haunt you and instead stand beside you as allies. This fluency in dreams and symbols is not intellectual. It is devotional. It asks you to kneel before the strangeness of your own soul and listen without judgment. And when you do, the shadow's disguises fall away, and what once felt like torment begins to feel like initiation. From here, the path turns practical again. Having learned the language of the unconscious, we must now apply it to our lived patterns, shifting from loops into spirals. That is the next threshold, practicing how to step out of repetition and into evolution. Patterns do not vanish simply because you understand them. Recognition is only the first step. Practice is what turns insight into transformation. This is where we learn to shift from loops into spirals. A loop repeats in the same flat circle, imprisoning you in old endings. A spiral revisits the same ground, but with new perspective, carrying you deeper, wider, higher. The difference is not in the trigger, but in your response. Think of the emotional loop, the relationship that collapses again, the panic at the same hour, the wound pressed by new hands. These are rehearsals of a frozen moment in your psyche. Without awareness, you act out the script exactly as before. With practice, you pause, notice, and choose differently, not perfectly, but consciously. That pause is the hinge that turns the loop into a spiral. This work always begins with the inner child. At the core of every loop is a child who learned, "I am too much," or "I am not enough." That wound froze in time, and now you replay it in adulthood. Shadow work asks you to return to that child, not to scold or rescue, but to stand beside them and say, "I see you. I'm here now. I won't leave again." The loop dissolves when the child is no longer abandoned in the moment of pain. Boundaries grow from this same soil. The rage you once repressed becomes instruction. It tells you where your limits are. Fear becomes guidance. It tells you what matters enough to risk courage. Sadness becomes a map of your unmet needs. Instead of numbing or moralizing, you listen. Each emotion is no longer a trap, but a teacher. This is how you begin to spiral upward, by honoring what was once exiled. Integration also requires accountability. Projection feeds the loop. Presence dissolves it. When someone triggers you, instead of naming them toxic, you ask, "What part of me is touched here?" This does not excuse harm. It liberates you from believing your freedom depends on their change. The power to end the loop lies not in controlling others, but in becoming present with yourself. Consider the everyday shift this creates. Where once you sought love by proving your worth, now you simply breathe into your own presence. Where once you apologized for existing, now you speak truth with clarity rather than violence. Where once you played roles for acceptance, now you stand as a soul rather than a performance. You stop chasing validation as though you were a thirsty ghost. You begin to drink from your own inner well. This spiral practice is not linear. You will revisit pain. You will still feel fear. You will still be tempted to repeat old patterns. But each return offers new layers of tenderness, awareness, and courage. That is the difference between a loop and a spiral. One imprisons, the other evolves. Imagine your life not as a flat circle, but as a coiled path upward. At each level, the same wound may appear, but you bring new insight, new grace. You re-enter the same cave with a stronger flame. You revisit the same heartbreak with greater compassion. You walk into the same fear with wider lungs. That is growth. Not perfection, but presence. Not escape, but evolution. This spiral practice is itself a devotion. It requires daily choices, to pause before reacting, to breathe before fleeing, to speak instead of shrinking, to listen instead of projecting. Each small act is an alchemical fire, burning away the loop and forging the spiral. From here, the descent deepens again. For the shadow path always leads to the underworld stage of transformation, the Nigredo, the grave threshold, the symbolic death before renewal. To step into that territory is to move from spiral practice into sacred initiation. That is where we go next. Every true descent carries you toward a moment that feels like dying. Jung called this stage the Nigredo, the blackening, the symbolic death before rebirth. Alchemists described it as the dark phase where all that is false burns away. Mystics called it the dark night of the soul. However you name it, this is the grave threshold, the point at which the persona you built to survive no longer works, and the self you buried begins to rise. This is not a physical death. It is the end of performance, the collapse of illusions, the crumbling of identities that once won you love but cost you truth. You may feel panic, despair, or emptiness. You may fear you are losing everything. But what is dying is not your essence. It is the mask, the inherited script, the self-forgetting patterns that kept you circling the same loops. On the other side of the grave threshold lies return. Not a return to innocence, but to authenticity. Wholeness is not about never feeling pain or fear again. It is about no longer being ruled by them. You rise into a presence that can hold contradiction, light and dark, grief and hope, rage and tenderness. You realize you are not broken, only fragmented, and those fragments are finding their way home. This is where vows emerge, the quiet inner promises that mark your sovereignty. I will not abandon myself again. I will not confuse intensity with love. I will not betray my body to keep peace. I will not trade truth for performance. These vows are not declarations of perfection. They are commitments to presence. They turn the loop into a spiral each time you return to them. The final warning is simple yet profound. The work you avoid is the gate to the power you seek. The part of you you hate is the doorway to the love you crave. The loop you fear is the exact place your liberation waits. To resist this is to remain imprisoned. To embrace it is to become whole. This is not a utopia. Pain will still come, but it will no longer own you. Fear will still whisper, but it will no longer dictate your story. Loops may still appear, but they will no longer bind you. You will walk them as spirals, each return a revelation, each trigger a teacher, each descent a chance to reclaim what you once left behind. At this stage, the self greets you, not the mask or the role, but the blueprint of wholeness that has always lived beneath the surface. The self does not shout or demand. It waits, and when you finally arrive, exhausted from looping, ready at last, it whispers, "Welcome back." From this center, you create differently. You set boundaries that protect rather than punish. You build relationships that nurture safety rather than replay old wounds. You speak not to be liked, but to be real. You create art, words, rituals, not for performance, but for expression. You live not to be seen, but to be true. This is the spiral path. Not perfection, but presence. Not performance, but permission. Not escape, but embodiment. You learn to say yes to your rage without destruction. Yes to your grief without collapse. Yes to your fear without paralysis. Each yes brings you closer to the integration that ends the inner war. And so, we close where we began. With the ache in your bones, the loops that haunted you, the shadow that knocked. You now know they were not curses but invitations. They called you not into despair, but into descent, into truth, into the sacred fire where false selves burn and the real self rises. This is the final warning. Do not wait for the loops to disappear on their own. Do not keep numbing or projecting. Go directly to the shadow. Go to the part of you still trembling, still sabotaging, still weeping in silence and say, "I'm listening. I'm staying. I'm here now." And when you do, you will not return as a perfect being, but as a whole one. That is the only way out. What does it mean to rise after the descent? Not to float above life untouched, but to walk within it differently. Wholeness is not escape from complexity. It is intimacy with it. You carry your shadow now not as a secret shame, but as a sacred ally. You no longer spend your days hiding from what aches within. You look directly at it, and by looking, you free yourself. The final vow of this journey is sovereignty. You no longer wait for others to mirror your worth, because you have reclaimed the mirror within. You no longer mistake chaos for passion, because you know the difference between fire that consumes and fire that warms. You no longer tolerate what drains your soul, because you have felt the cost of self-abandonment and will not pay it again. From this grounded place, presence itself becomes your practice. Presence with grief so it can soften into tenderness. Presence with fear so it can reveal courage. Presence with shame so it can uncover humility. Presence with rage so it can instruct your boundaries. Each presence turns an enemy into a teacher, a loop into a spiral. The gift is not that you never fall, but that when you do, you know who you are. You fall without losing yourself. You grieve without forgetting your worth. You rage without abandoning your love. That is integration. Not sainthood, but coherence. And as you walk this way, the world shifts in subtle but undeniable ways. You stop projecting your inner enemies onto others. You see their shadows without collapsing into judgment. You stop begging for space and begin taking your place, rooted in your own body and breath. The loops that once felt like prisons now reveal themselves as maps, pointing you toward the very places your soul longed for you to return. This is why shadow work is not optional. It is essential. Not because you are broken, but because you are divided. Not because you are weak, but because you were once forced to fragment in order to survive. Your sacred task is to remember yourself, piece by piece, loop by loop, descent by descent. The shadow you once feared is no longer a stranger. It is the part of you that carried the unbearable until you were ready. Now you are ready, and readiness changes everything. So here is the benediction. Go to the parts you still resist. Go to the child who never got to speak, to the lover who still waits, to the rebel who still hides. Bring them home. Because they never stopped calling. They never stopped waiting. And now, neither will you. This is the spiral, the return, the rise. This is the work Jung called necessary, the final warning he left us with. That shadow work is the only way out of your emotional loops. Not a detour, not a side practice, but the way itself. And now, you walk it.